Hi everyone, bonjour à tous. I'm your host, Cole Stangler. Welcome to the second episode of What Do We Want? Conversations with the International Left. Bienvenue à notre deuxième épisode. Pour les francophones qui nous regardent sur YouTube, je vous invite à activer les sous-titres en cliquant sur l'icône en bas à droite. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation with today's guest, which makes, I think, for a really natural transition from our first episode. If you remember, Congresswoman Deli Ramirez was talking to us about the wave of progressives expected to be elected in November. Today, we're lucky enough to be joined by someone who I think is really among the most exciting of these progressive candidates. That's none other than Kat Abughazaleh. Kat Abughazaleh is running for Congress in Illinois' 9th Congressional District, which includes parts of the city of Chicago and some of its northwestern suburbs. If you don't already know her, she's a journalist and commentator, maybe best known for her work at Media Matters, where she covered the far right, and in particular, Tucker Carlson at Fox News. If elected, Kat will be the youngest woman ever elected to Congress. She's 26 years old. She'd also be the second Palestinian-American woman elected to Congress after Rashida Tlaib. If you're looking at the polls, she has a pretty good chance at doing just that. In any case, we're going to find out pretty soon because that primary is scheduled on Tuesday, March 17th. And the winner of that primary is heavily favored in the general election in November. Without further ado, let's get right into it. Kat Abughazaleh, thanks so much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so the first question I want to ask you, it's a question, I hope it isn't too corny, but it's how basically we've started this series, which is the title of the show, okay, which is What Do We Want? So the question for you, I want to ask just to kind of get things started, assuming it's not too corny. What do you want? You're running for Congress. What do you plan to be fighting for?
I don't think anything is too corny, by the way. I think we should embrace corniness and cringe. I want a country that works. I want a world where everyone can thrive and not just survive. I don't want to have to call an Uber instead of an ambulance. I don't want my tax dollars to be used to kill civilians and kill anyone. I want a world that I know we can have, but because of a small amount of people in power, we've been denied. I want to be able to have a family. I want to not live in a planet that's burning. I want to have the world go to the stars, but I don't want it to be because of billionaires. I want solar punk, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Do you I mean, so one of the things also that people we're talking to is they have kind of different labels that they're going to use, right? So I think we talked to Congresswoman Ramirez. She's, talks about being a progressive. Some people kind of embrace the populist label. Other candidates, right, socialists, being a socialist is important. Do any of those kind of labels matter to you, or are you just sort of a left-wing candidate? What sort of, does that kind of enter into your mind, having that label?
I mean, I think from Fox News, the term is actually radical, communist, Antifa, scary person. But I consider myself a progressive populist. I consider myself a democratic socialist. And you know what? I'm going to embrace the solar punk label. It's my favorite genre, and that's the world I want.
I wasn't expecting people to say that, but I think you'll be the first guest and maybe the only one to use that label. So it's a good one.
I hope not. I'm going to try to make it catch on because that's the world that I want.
I'm all in favor of that. So I just asked you that question, but I think maybe another one to kind of get things started is talk a little bit about your story. So I talked about you in the introduction a little bit, but tell me a little bit about kind of how you decided to run for Congress. You're working in kind of the media world. I remember seeing that video that you released back in, I think, March 2025.
Yeah.
Kind of at the peak of all the Doge insanity and craziness, which is this kind of particular moment also. You made this video, you dropped the F-bomb in the video, very sort of like catchy video. What kind of made you push you to actually decide, okay, I'm not just going to sit around and, I don't know, comment or be a media kind of personality, but actually decide to just kind of do the thing and run for Congress? What pushed you to actually do that?
Yeah, so I covered the right for Media Matters, Mother Jones, Zateo News, my own freelancing, and then also I did a long 1-hour video explainer about white Christian nationalism with People for the American Way. And I and my colleagues have warned Democrats about this exact moment. We told them about January 6th before it happened. We told them about where the DEI CRT anti-trans panic would lead, and they didn't listen. We told them about attempts to mainstream the Great Replacement theory, and they didn't listen. In fact, some of them actually partnered with those very same people to punish campus protesters who were speaking out against the genocide in Gaza, many of whom were Jewish, by the way. The Great Replacement theory, for those who aren't aware, is an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that essentially alleges that liberals, which is a stand-in for Jews, are trying to replace the white electorate with black and brown people.
We get a lot of that in France also. The Great Replacement is a big...
It actually originated in France.
Here.
Yeah, the modern Great Replacement theory, y'all gave that to us. So thanks for that, by the way.
We have some more positive contributions, but it's true, the Great Replacement, one of these French exports actually.
You win some, you lose some, you know?
States.
Yeah, it's a shame, but what can you do? What you can do is fight against the right, which is what I've been doing. And I was ranting so much to my boyfriend and my cat because when Trump won, I maybe naively was like, well, someone's got to do something, right? Like they're not just going to let him run all over them, right? And then they did. There were all these Democrats sitting there at his inauguration. There were people voting for his appointees. I was so disgusted and I got sick of ranting to my boyfriend and my cat. And I just thought, okay, I'll do it then. I've spent so many years waiting for someone to listen and I'm sick of waiting. I feel like, especially in the Democratic Party, there's this idea that like, okay, we'll listen to the left behind closed doors, but that's all we're going to do. And so I decided to do something myself. No one's going to save us. Life isn't a movie. We are what saves us. So I threw my hat in the ring.
And I think that frustration that you're talking about of kind of sitting around and just being like, when are the Democrats going to do something? I can tell you also that internationally, in France, I mean, that's the question that I maybe get the most is people are asking like, what on earth is the Democratic Party doing to stick up to Trump? People don't understand this sort of, I don't know if you want to call it like timidity, you know, being timid. Is it just they're structurally incapable? But there's, you know, it's not just in the United States. Like the world is looking at the weakness of the Democratic Party today and saying, I mean, what is going on? What's it going to take to have a little bit more pushback against this far right authoritarian leader we have in the U.S.?
Well, it's supposed to be an opposition party, but it sometimes feels like there's not sometimes, often it feels like there's no opposition, particularly from leadership. And a lot of that comes to corporate interests. A lot of that comes to special interest money like AIPAC. It's this pathetic selfishness of caring more about your own power and being reelected than actually doing the job you were elected to do. I have learned so much about our campaign finance system, which I thought I was pretty knowledgeable about before I ran. There is so much more BS under the surface that it's awful, and it makes it almost impossible for working class candidates to run for office in the first place. I wouldn't have been able to without this large platform that, yes, I've built myself with my own reporting, but it's still a privilege to have. And even in our race, I've been able to successfully push many of my opponents to the left, or what I consider the center, especially on foreign policy, but a variety of issues, and to be more aggressive against this administration. I mean, I was the first one and continue to be the only one for weeks physically confronting ICE. And then some of my opponents were like, okay, then we should probably get out there too, because that's what we should be expecting from our leaders. It's not enough to cast a vote. You have to be publicly and privately pressuring your team to be better.
And it's a good reminder also, even having these sort of progressive left-wing socialist primary challengers, what that means for the rest of the party is that, like you said, you have people reacting against what you're doing and you're able to push them in a direction, regardless of, we'll see what happens in the election. And I hope it goes as well as possible. But there's even the fact of running, you're having an impact on the sort of mainstream candidates. To talk a little bit more about your campaign, it's one thing that, you're sitting around, you're frustrated, you're angry like everyone, you decide to actually run. How do you then, you're in a pretty heavily Democratic leaning district. What are the kinds of issues that you've been sort of focusing on when you're kind of campaigning, right? You have to focus on a message. How have you been deciding to run this campaign?
Yeah, so I want to talk first off about how we've been running this, because when I launched, I was like, I want to do politics differently. And everyone says that, but no one actually does it. But we are. So first off, because I have this platform, I have a lot of wiggle room to be able to do things that either haven't been considered or have been just written off as they won't work because no one's ever tried them. Because I had, a large audience and the ability to fundraise more than other grassroots candidates right off the bat, which once again is a privilege to have. And I want to get to a point where we have publicly funded elections, because that should not be the case. But we use our resources to not just reach voters, but materially improve their lives. Our office in Rogers Park, which is in Chicago, doubles as a mutual aid hub. So we have people come in every single day and they get what they need, whether that's coats, books, Narcan, baby formula, diapers, first aid kits, toothbrushes, toothpaste, shampoo, conditioner. And we want to extend that to our government office if elected. And it's been really great, not just because of the people that we're helping, but also because of how many people feel helpless in the face of fascism. And we are giving them a tangible thing that they can do to improve their community. Because one of the biggest complaints you'll hear among Democratic consultants is no one wants to be involved in politics anymore. And it's because we've been used as voters for donations, and then we're told to knock doors till we're burnt out, and that's it. And so instead we said, hey, do you want to do something else? Do you want to make a positive change locally? Do you want to stop doom scrolling and come hang out with like-minded people? And we've had a lot of young people, including young men who the Democratic Party keep talking about how we need to move to the right towards to capture them, that have been involved in our campaign because of that. It's why we had the largest volunteer base in our campaign or in our race. But our top two issues are anti-authoritarianism, which is exactly what it sounds like, and my specialty. The house is on fire, and we can't redo the house until we put out the fire. But the second issue is what I call basic existence. And it's this idea that everyone deserves to afford housing, groceries, and healthcare with money left over to save and spend. I know that doesn't sound very radical in any of our peer countries, but in the United States,
it sounds good to me.
It sounds great, right? And it's the reality is Republicans want to talk about fiscal responsibility, and that's why we have to give billionaires tax breaks and why we have to keep pumping money into the military-industrial complex. But a single-payer healthcare system, protections against price gouging, and building more housing with federal incentives to work with local businesses saves us money. These are more effective and efficient systems than what we have now. And, during this administration, my job is going to be stalling this administration's agenda wherever possible, where there is room for bipartisan work, such as AI regulation, reversing Trump's tariffs. There are also some smaller issues. We're in standard time right now, but I hate daylight savings time. We can pass a bill to make that nationwide. So we're just on standard time all the time. Pretty sure almost everyone will get reelected for that. That's some bipartisan work I'm down to work on, but I'm not down to sacrifice basic human rights in the name of compromise. But after Trump and over the next 2 years, I want to be pushing the party in a direction that we can have a New Deal, a whole government approach that addresses the intersectionality of all these issues. We can't talk about affordability without mentioning that renewables cost less than fossil fuels, or education without removing the lead pipes in Chicago schools. We can't talk about crime we can't just be pouring more money into law enforcement. No, we have to address material conditions. And that also means universal pre-K. I think we should start universal basic income as well here, starting with stay-at-home parents. So that way they have their own income. They're not reliant on their partner. This would keep people from being stuck in a relationship. Families just have more money in their pockets. We are paying invisible labor, which is most of the labor done in the world. And additionally, we are ensuring that people have better outcomes for their future. So all of this falls under basic existence. And I grouped it together because I feel like there is this idea that you just address one and then you kind of do a half measure and then you just don't talk about it for 20 years. But in reality, all of these impact each other, and we aren't going to get anywhere with half measures or incrementalism.
And I think one of the other threads I noticed in what you said there is this idea that the state actually is a actor of social progress, which is such a basic thing that it's I think the way that a lot of Europeans and people on the left here tend to view politics. Well, if you want to address these inequities and improve people's material conditions, well, obviously, you use the power of the state to do that. It's something that was a taboo or sort of seen as misguided in American politics for a long time, but you're part of this newer generation of politicians, and maybe with a few older examples, I'm thinking of Bernie Sanders, of people saying, you know what, actually, there's nothing wrong about actually advocating for using the power of the state to improve people's lives. Such a basic point that I say over and over again to people in France for understanding this kind of American left. You guys are kind of reclaiming the power of the state, which, like you said, you mentioned the New Deal. It's worked before, right? We've had this. Americans have had a different relationship to the public sector.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Let's see. Another question I like to ask is you mentioned the New Deal. I mentioned Bernie Sanders, but are there it's a question I like to ask politicians when I interview them. Are there your future politician or candidate? I don't know how. I think you are a politician at this point. Are there like examples that you think of sort of sources of inspiration, whether that is someone today who's in Congress or elected in the U.S. or internationally? It could be a kind of previous historical example. Are there people you look at and think, this is someone who kind of inspires me, who I want to be like when I'm elected?
I mean, FDR and Bernie Sanders are definitely up there. I think, obviously, in the U.S., we have AOC, Rashida Tlaib, Zoran Mamdani. I'd also say that Senator Chris Van Hollen is a huge inspiration for me. I'm Palestinian, and he has consistently been advocating for human rights, no matter someone's ethnicity, no matter their state, for his entire career. After the murder of Shireen Abu Akleh, who's a Palestinian journalist who was killed in Israel by Israeli soldiers, she was also an American citizen. He still has not given up trying to find out about her murder. As far as internationally, I am a Claudia Scheinbaum fangirl. Plain and simple. She is so cool. And, I grew up in the South, so I spent a lot of time in Mexico, and I just think she's awesome.
We're hopefully going to be speaking with people from Morena later, but I'm glad you mentioned that because Mexico is such a, I think, interesting kind of success story It's an example of where the left is super popular that I think, from my point of view, maybe doesn't get talked about enough in the United States. It's like, how do you get to the place where you have an extremely popular left-wing coalition that's winning? And so I'm glad you mentioned Steinbaum. I want to, before we focus in on a couple of the issues that you've really kind of hit on in the campaign, is you kind of alluded to this, but a question maybe about the obstacles. We were talking to Congresswoman Delia Ramirez last time, who was telling us about this, and you alluded to it, this issue of the money in politics. Just like concretely, when you're a progressive and you're running, you're up against these forces that much of the international left doesn't have to contend with to the same extent in the United States, where we have basically a form of legalized corruption
Yes.
I think that's the best way to frame it. So I don't want to answer the question for you, but what are sort of maybe the biggest obstacles you faced while you're trying to implement, this sort of vision running for Congress?
I mean, first off, it's how expensive campaigns are. Like, we've raised, I believe, $3.5 million, and that still doesn't hold a candle to the amount that AIPAC, the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee, is pouring into this race. They just released this really weird AI-generated ad about me where they quoted my high school newspaper. Yeah, it was really cool. Definitely worth $160,000, which is what they've spent on it so far. But it's wildly expensive to run campaigns. It's wildly expensive to run ads. I've been campaigning for almost a year now. Our campaigns go for so long, and every single state has a different primary day, which, especially when it comes to like the presidency, it's a very expensive racket that just goes on forever. So people are essentially always running for office instead of doing their job. I'm actually a fan of how France does their elections. I went to George Washington University, and you have to take a math class, and so I took math and politics, where we studied different election methods. And the Hare method, which is like the base form of what France's election system is based off of, is my ideal election system. And I think that it also leaves room for, ranked choice voting and those types of things, essentially eliminating the need for a two-party system and allowing other people to be involved. But there's also this, it's really, really difficult to run for office as a working class candidate, because when you run for office in America, the first thing you'll be asked is, how many people do you know who can give you a maximum individual contribution on day one? And that's $7,000. I said 0, and people would literally hang up the phone. And then when we were able to raise $200K in grassroots donations on day one, they called me back and they were like, oh, my finger slipped, sorry. But it's not just the fact that it's so much easier to run for office if you are already rich or a lot of rich people, but also just the fact that you essentially can't work. I mean, for me, my job is literally a conflict of interest. I can't report on things because I'm actively running for office. So I've just completely depleted my savings. My partner has been picking up some of my slack, but that's not sustainable. We have 8 days left to go. So thank God this will end one way or another. And taking on debt. And this is, if you're a working class candidate, if you're even able to make it to election day, that is a very common story. And there are safeguards for this, but they are, once again, hacked and created for the rich. So if you are a federal non-incumbent candidate, you can take a candidate salary, which is out of your own donations, but I'm fine with that because it's supposed to make it easier for working class candidates to run. But the way that it's calculated is it's half of your average income over the last 5 years up to the congressional salary, which is $174,000. So if you've been making $100,000 over the last 5 years, then you have $50,000, which is not as much as it could be, especially in a big city, but definitely helpful. If you're making $200K, you have $100K to work off of. But if you are a parent for a family of 4 living at the poverty level, which is $32,000 a year, that's slashed to $16,000. How are you supposed to live on that? So it's already this measure that is supposed to be for poor and working class candidates doesn't even help us. We calculated mine, so like I graduated in 2020, and then a lot of my payouts for my work that I was doing as a freelance reporter came in on January 2nd. And that's also subtracted from that. So we calculated it, and it was like $12 a day.
Yeah.
It's the entire system is rigged against working class candidates.
And it's something that, I said before, like, I think people don't grasp the problem of outside the United States. You guys don't just have to deal with, like, okay, what campaign issues am I going to focus on? How do I what's the right message? It's like you have this giant structural obstacle of the campaign finance problem. I also didn't mention that, I mentioned very briefly in the intro, but I don't want to make a big deal of it, but you would be the youngest woman also elected to Congress. I actually don't think it should be a big deal to have people in their 20s elected to Congress. It actually happens quite often in Europe, but we're in this system in the United States where, maybe you have the average age of elected members of Congress. I don't, but it's a very, very high.
It's 58.
58, okay.
And the average American is 38.
There you go. So
also, half of Congress is worth $1 million or more, and I could promise you that not half of Americans are in the same boat.
Yeah. So having just a little bit of Congress looks a little bit more like ordinary people, I think, is a good and healthy thing in a democratic society, which is presumably what we have in the United States.
Presumably, allegedly. I do also think that's important because I don't think all of Congress should just be 26-year-old journalists, but I also think we need a diversity background, and that means race, ethnicity, religion, sex, gender, but also in class and income. And because it's difficult to legislate on ideas that are abstract to you. If you haven't had to pay rent because you've owned your home for the last 30 years, you don't know how expensive it is and how difficult it is to even get an apartment in the first place. So how are you able to make effective legislation, even if you're going in with good intentions?
Well, this is like the Democrats under the Biden administration, where it was the sense among some Democrats where they would say, well, I don't understand. Like, look at the economy of, objective criteria. GDP growth is great. The economy is booming. Like, I don't understand. Why are these people upset? And it shows you, it's a simple point, but it's like when you have that disconnect where you literally don't understand what it's like to not, be having all of your money coming in through the stock market and your investments and living comfortably, then, I don't know, are you the best positioned person to be making public policy? I'm sort of skeptical of that idea. I want to talk about a couple of specific kind of issues that you've campaigned on or talked about in the campaign, starting with these were sort of seen as kind of these, I don't know, by a certain part of the, the kind of the commentary, kind of political media people looking at Democratic Party debates would say that maybe these are, these kind of hot button issues that maybe aren't the best issues to be running on. But that was their take. But I wanna get yours. I mean, you've talked about openly about abolishing ICE. Some people would say, okay, this is. I'll give you an example of someone I was talking to. So overseas, granted, but a kind of longtime expert of the U.S. saying, "Oh my God, the Democrats are basically going to make the same mistake they made under Biden. They're becoming too radical. You have people calling for abolishing ICE. This is going to not play well with the general public." Tell me why you call for abolishing ICE. Why is that important?
I mean, for the first time since its inception in 2003, the majority of Americans support the abolition of ICE. And honestly, it's kind of shocking to hear that from a European standpoint, unless they're like trying to consider this of, like what Americans might think about it, because this is a secret police force. Yeah. The administration is literally pushing Nazi slogans that were used during World War II on their podiums will they talk about kidnapping people and putting them in concentration camps. This is a moral and legal imperative. There was a world before ICE and there was a world after ICE. Many people across the world actually have seen a video of me being thrown to the ground by an ICE agent violently. That was not the first time that happened, but they don't care. These are masked men who are torturing communities because of a white nationalist agenda. And we had an immigration system before DHS and ICE. Yeah. So we need to dismantle DHS, abolish ICE. We need to move their funding to education and healthcare. We need to have trials for not just the people in the administration, but the agents who have terrorized these communities. We need to return DHS's powers back to the departments that they were originally under: justice, transportation, Treasury. There were a bunch of different departments where their powers were taken because of the creation of DHS. We also need to repeal the Patriot Act. And we also, and this is trying to be painted as radical by the right now, but this was actually, there was a very similar bipartisan proposal under the Bush administration for something like this, which my position is that we can't just keep saying the words pathway to citizenship anymore. We need to give full amnesty and citizenship to all immigrants here who have not committed a violent crime. Immigration is good for our economy. It is good for our country. And it's absolutely ridiculous that we have let it get this bad.
Let's see, I wanted to ask you sort of next about another question. I'll cite someone who, it's kind of an easy target, I think, but I want to quote him anyways because he was critical of this. There's this idea that maybe some people on the left are talking too much about Palestine, about Gaza, that maybe the Democrats should spend less time talking about that. I mentioned in the introduction, you're Palestinian-American, your father is Palestinian-American. Tell me why you think it's so important to actually keep talking about Palestine, to keep talking about Gaza. Why that's actually something that's important to do when you're running for Congress.
Well, first off, it matters to voters, and I think that falls into three different camps. Some people belong to one, some people belong to two, some people belong to all three. First off, the humanitarian aspect, a genocide being enacted with our tax dollars with no oversight. I believe that any country that receives aid, that aid should be conditional on not violating crimes against humanity. I also think it's essential for the United States to sign on to the Rome Statute and be subjected to the same international laws and procedures as almost every other country in the world. Second, there's this idea that we are sending billions upon billions of dollars for missiles that are shot into schools and hospitals while we can't even afford to go to our own hospitals, while we don't have a healthcare system, while we can't afford to pay rent or buy groceries. And it's like, why are we spending all of this money to do that instead of helping people here? And then third, there's the idea of the imperial boomerang of what your country will do to others, it will eventually do to you. And ICE is actually using technology and tactics devised by the IDF and utilized in Gaza against American people right now. So we're seeing all three of those things in real time, and people care about it. And I think it is kind of emblematic to a lot of Americans of what is wrong with our country, of this active ignoring of the American people, of voters. Even the DNC pushed this finding down, but they found out that Gaza was actually a big reason that Harris didn't win in 2024, and they tried their best to not let that get out. I am Palestinian. My grandparents were expelled in the Nakba. My father was born stateless in Kuwait. But I don't just care about this because I'm Palestinian. I care about this because I care about people. And I think that you're referencing Matt Iglesias.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't often mention his name. Matt Iglesias talked about it.
He's often wrong, so I don't blame him here either. But if you're just saying stop talking about it, you're saying stop talking about crimes against humanity, a genocide committed with your tax dollars, Matt, my tax dollars. It's horrific. And meanwhile, we're still arming other genocides, like what we're seeing in Sudan. We are carpet bombing schools in Iran. if we aren't supposed to talk about these things, then what are we supposed to talk about?
Yeah. No, I mean, I'm with you 100%. I mean, I think there's like the political. I mean, first off, if you're really purely just looking at it from a kind of electoralist kind of perspective, there are parts of the country that have and Democrats who are shifting on the issue, where actually in line with what mainstream or a big chunk of what Democrats think is, should be what they view on Israel and Gaza. And then secondly, I think to your point, there seems to be something about, I don't know, when you see the horrors happening of, there's a connection, I think, between that authoritarianism that we see, the far right authoritarianism with Trump and with Netanyahu, where there's this aspect, I think, of people seeing these horrors unfold before their eyes and having a kind of political class that's unwilling to acknowledge what everyone sees in front of them. I think that makes it all the more important. But I think I want to ask you about Iran in just a second. But at the very end, we'll get to foreign policy. Maybe a question about about what to do with Trump. Imagine, so you're ideal circumstances, you're elected on Tuesday, March 17th, or sorry, excuse me, you win the primary, then elected in November. You're coming into a Congress dealing with this president who I don't need to really to describe him. What do you do with Trump? Is there a specific question I want to ask? Is there was this push, right, to impeach, right? We saw before. Is that something worth doing again, just because of
Yes.
sort of? Yeah. Okay. The answer is yes.
Yes. And I think this idea of like every time he commits an impeachable offense being like, well, we won't get votes, or, it's not going to work this time. Okay, that's still time not being spent passing horrific, racist, authoritarian Republican agenda. And also, I think personally that people should be held accountable, and we should do our best to hold people accountable for crimes that they commit. If we're talking about ideal circumstances, I mean, day one, I'm introducing articles of impeachment to impeach, convict, and remove this monster.
And I think I sort of came of age. I'm I'm 10 years or so older than you, but I remember, right, the Bush years, the lack of accountability, and to me, in some ways, it's can go back to that, of the lack of accountability for the Bush administration, for the following the war in Iraq, the abuses, right, the impeachable offenses, and there really never seemed to be accountability. So it's an important point. Maybe a final quick question just before we kind of move to the end about foreign policy. I want to ask you what it's like campaigning in this very kind of weird, fragmented media environment that we have today. You're very effective at social media. How do you navigate this? I think it's a simple question, but how do you navigate this super bizarre, fragmented, polarized media landscape we're in today in the United States, where we don't really have kind of these shared media resources? How do you kind of make sure that your message is able to break through?
I mean, we try to be everywhere, not just on social media, but on, podcasts and digital media, of course, but also in our ads, also in our mail program, also in our door knocking program, also with our phone banking, with our text banking, with just regular canvassing, with business canvassing. We're trying to reach everyone, no matter where they are or what they do. But also it helps that for a living, I covered media and narratives. So I understand this intrinsically. Like, there is a part of this that is second nature to me, especially when it comes to, getting press requests from weird people that I think a lot of campaigns would just say yes to because they want coverage, and then me knowing exactly who that right-wing figure is and saying, absolutely not. I don't care if their podcast is on Substack. I don't use Substack. And so I just, part of it is just second nature to me.
And I also want to take the opportunity to thank you for joining me on my podcast. So I appreciate that very much. I want to maybe end here by talking about some foreign policy questions, one of which you alluded to, which is just, of course, dominating kind of everything at the moment, which is this horrific war in Iran launched by the United States and Israel, creating havoc across the Middle East. Things could evolve a lot in the next few months, of course, but what would you do today if you were in Congress? Let's say you're in Congress right now. What do you do about what's happening with the war in Iran?
I mean, first off, I would obviously vote for the War Powers Resolution to stop this war, but I also think that there's this aspect, as you alluded to, we're in a very progressive district here. When people are voting, they need to be able to count on us to not just cast our votes, but also to enact pressure within the party. 4 Democrats voted against the War Powers Resolution, which meant that it didn't pass. And if they had voted for it, it would have. Those people should be excommunicated from the party. They should be publicly and privately pressured to reverse their position. And they should be seen as an active disgrace in the Democratic Party. And the fact that they aren't is not just disappointing, it's disgusting.
I don't know how it's possible to have Democrats who would not just vote for exercising basic rights as legislators. It's shocking to me. And who knows what's going to happen over the next few months? Such a kind of volatile, unpredictable, horrific situation. I want to move now to another topic to ask you about, which kind of concerns us more, particularly here in Europe. So you talked about this principle, okay, for you. The way you frame it is self-determination, right? You talked about the importance of self-determination for Palestinians, but also for Ukrainians as well. So just to give a very quick recap. So there was this, right? There was an article about from Dropsite News. We don't have to go through all the details, but basically talking about a little bit critical of some of your positions on when it comes to Ukraine and Taiwan. So saying that you support the U.S. continuing to provide military aid to Ukraine, and then Taiwan, which maybe we can get to in a second, but saying how the U.S. should move away from its position of strategic ambiguity and to actively say that the U.S. would support Taiwan if Taiwan were to be invaded by China, which is not a completely remote possibility. So you were sort of criticized in, there was this article. We don't have to kind of relitigate everything, but I saw then an interview you gave where you were kind of talking about your positions on Ukraine and Taiwan. And the way you framed it, which to me I think is a really smart, effective way of framing it, is you talked about the importance of self-determination. So I want to kind of ask you the question again of sort of why for you is it important for the United States at this current moment and juncture to support Ukraine vis-a-vis Russia, continuing to support Ukraine, and then there are 2 massive questions, but then maybe we can get to also the second part of that, which is the position on Taiwan.
Yeah, so I think first off, when it comes to Ukraine, Putin doesn't want to stop at Ukraine. And I think everyone in Europe knows that. And, a lot of us here know that. I cover authoritarians for a living, and it doesn't stop there. We need, it's standing up to a bully, and we promise support here. I also do think that all military aid should be conditional. That includes Israel, that includes Ukraine, that would include Mexico, because crimes against humanity should not be committed with our tax dollars. But we need to help Ukraine get to a better place at the bargaining table, so that way they are not completely taken over by Russia. Additionally, this is a proposal that we've seen in Europe too, of seizing Russian oligarch assets to pay for these weapons, and that is something I'm very supportive of, especially with that idea of people struggling here and not being able to, and sending so much in military aid. I understand how frustrating that is, and I think this is a very unique circumstance in Ukraine, so I'd absolutely support a push for that as well. But self-determination for me, there's a very personal aspect to this. If I'm Palestinian and our self-determination was taken from us, there are people that actively try to erase our existence, to say that we never existed as a people before. And this is something that we see in countries that rely on apartheid and genocide and discrimination over and over and over again. And that's what Putin wants to do. He wants to restore this empire that he believes he should own. And that's not how the world works now. And I also think that there is this, we are trying to move to an isolationist perspective that is just literally impossible to do in 2026. And we need to be more, not less involved with the rest of the world, but more involved, not in an interventionist way, but in cooperation with each other, in supporting each other in the UN, in the Paris Climate Accords, signing on to the Rome Statute, which I mentioned before. Mm-hmm. After Trump, we are going to have to go on a decades-long apology tour, trying to build up any goodwill or any legitimacy that has been lost, which is pretty much all of it. And that means that we will need to steer our foreign policy to be focusing on that cooperation and not dictating what other countries should do or what they, how they should be, but instead finding ways to peacefully become a part of this international cooperative framework that we have now. That means also something I'm very passionate about is reparations to the global south, much of which has been devastated by American imperialism, especially in the forms of renewable energy and infrastructure. This is how we get a better future. It's not through more war. It's not through shutting us off everywhere else. It's not through these unconstitutional, illegal, and devastating tariffs. It's by holding out a hand and hoping that other people are willing to take it.
Yeah. And you mentioned also, you've talked about before the importance of USAID restoring, right, these cuts. USAID,
Sorry.
Maybe something dropped there, but the USAID, which was one of these, basically projects that, Elon Musk and Doge taking a scalpel to this aid organization that has knock-on effects around the world. When you talk to people in the kind of humanitarian sector, they'll tell you that, well, we lost a contract with USAID, and the knock-on effects are just, enormously significant. I think maybe that's something, from my point of view, that maybe sometimes Americans and some progressives even neglect, is to understand that, like, USAID and some of these programs actually, have positive benefits around the world. And so it's interesting, I think in some ways refreshing just to have a progressive candidate that's saying, well, of course, right, USAID needs to be restored.
There is this idea that I've seen, especially among the American left, and look, going in with a completely good intentions, trying to understand that perspective of USAID is a tool for U.S. imperialism. And I disagree. I mean, I understand where it comes from because we have done so many devastating things. And I do agree with the idea that there are parts of our government and parts of our legislature that does view it in that way. But what I'm saying is that we need to not just come in, but elect leaders who can come in and change how it's done. So it's not forcing other countries to rely on us, but instead using our immense wealth that we have built on the destruction of others to restore the harm that we've caused. And a healthier, safer, more prosperous world means a healthier, safer, more prosperous America.
And I have another question related to that, which is, I asked the same question to Congresswoman Ramirez when we had her on. And I know Europe is at the kind of last of the bottom of kind of concerns in the United States today for very obvious reasons. Maybe setting aside the conflict in Ukraine, of course. Do you think it's important for the United States to renew its ties with Europe, the transatlantic alliance going back to the Second World War that now is in doubt because the United States threatens to engage in military actions against some of these allies? Do you think the transatlantic alliance is something that's important to restore, to renew?
Absolutely. 100%. This should be a no-brainer. And the fact that Trump is antagonizing so many European leaders is because he wants to cozy up to the ones who are dictators. He wants to cozy up to Orban, to Putin. It's pathetic. It is the symptom of a weak man. But we are devastating not just our own country, where Americans are taking, I think, 93% of the brunt of these tariffs, but economies around the world, including in Europe. This should be a no-brainer. Our closest allies are supposed to be our closest allies. We are not supposed to treat them as adversaries.
Well, it's also, interesting just on this topic, some of these things are not, sort of the most important or kind of topics of interest for many kind of progressives in the United States. But I think when you're running for Congress and you're elected, you're not sort of choosing the world that, I guess we all have that kind of ideal world we want to live in, but you're coming into Congress today in 2026 or 2027 dealing with the aftermath of the Trump years, and the question is very concrete. It's what is the role of the United States in the world? And so these are questions that I know maybe are not at the top of kind of the list of priorities for
but something we'll have to reckon with.
Yeah. Let's see. I think that basically covered most of the questions I wanted to ask you. Is there anything else that you think is important that you want to kind of a point you want to make? I usually ask that also at the end of my interviews.
I remember seeing a post in the Greenland subreddit, because there were all these Americans flooding the Greenland subreddit saying, I'm so sorry, this isn't all of us. It's, our country isn't like this. It's just this crazy man in office. And then someone posting in the Greenland subreddit, okay, but it's still your country doing this. Just as the vast majority of people understand that not every single Russian loves Putin or is supportive of his war of aggression, we still understand that Russia is committing terror in Ukraine and that they are trying to push for an authoritarian regime. And you, as an Americans, have to deal with that too. And I think it's about time that we stop thinking of ourselves as the center of the world and instead reckon with the fact that we have committed so much damage, not just under Trump, but before, but that we also have so much potential. We truly do. I mean, some of the most incredible innovation. I'm a huge fan of stories. I often say, I say this like almost once a day at this point. Stories are the best thing that humans have ever done. We're some of the best storytellers. We have a dream for our country that so many people have come here for, and that people are not coming anymore because they think it's dead if it was ever alive. And I think that we should build a new dream, and I think that means cooperation in our country, across the world, and also just recognizing that this world is a lot bigger than just us, and we have a lot to learn.
I think it's a great point to end on. I'll just add very quickly. I mean, it's something that it's there are other imperial, there are bad actors out in the world that are not just the United States under the Trump administration, right? You mentioned Russia, right? We talked about Israel under Netanyahu. So refreshing and good to hear about, right? The trying to imagine an alternative U.S. foreign policy, which is not some abstract thing, but it's very real.
Yeah.
And then hopefully you'll be fighting for that in Congress, and
we'll see.
In just a few months' time. So, Kat Abughazaleh, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to What Do We Want? Conversations with the International Left. The show is produced by Troy Miller and We Act Radio. We have a number of very interesting guests coming up over the coming weeks. So don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel on YouTube. I'll see you soon.